and welcome to an analogy wrapped in a metaphor. We're going to demonstrate the four elements of exposure in a hopefully rather graphic and simple, clear way to do that. We have, first of all, what is that? Our light. And what kind of a day would you say it is? Look at all that light. It's a bright, sunny day. Okay. Second of all, we have our sensor. It needs a certain amount of light in order to be properly exposed. There it is, empty vessel, waiting for the light. We need a way to get the light from the world onto our sensor. What do you say? An aperture, perhaps? All right. Let's see what we can do about that. Aperture, thanks to the Swiss Army here. Let's make an aperture. Aperture is basically a hole, which we've just accomplished. And then we will need a way to stop the hole. How about a shutter in the form of a finger stopping the light coming through the aperture. Are we ready? Let's write this down. We have light. We'll call that sunny day. We have aperture. The hole, pretty small hole. We have shutter. Well, let's see. We have ISO. Needs a lot of light. Let's call it ISO 100. And let's call shutter. I don't know how much time we're going to need to fill up our sensor. So let's see. Here's our shutter's regulator. It's going to tell us how much time has passed. Take off your lens cap. Are we ready? And set, and here we go. Woo! Light's coming through the aperture, going onto the sensor. It's taking a certain amount of time. We're watching the time pass. The light go through the aperture. Okay, it's a little boring. It's a time exposure, all right? Watch the birds. Oh, it's a bright sunny day, but it's still taking quite a long time to fill up our sensor. Well, if I don't give it enough light, it's going to be underexposed. If I give it too much light, it's going to make a mess here, but it'll be overexposed. We do not want the cup running over here on our sensor. We're getting close. Boy, the time looks like it's getting pretty close to. And it's at, 60 seconds. No, let's call it 62. Let me recondition here. Okay, so let's look at our results. We have a bright sunny day. You can barely see that. We have a small aperture. Let's call that f16. We have ISO of 100. Takes quite a bit of light. And we got 60 seconds. Okay, so this is okay, except we're photographing a snail. And a snail, despite their slow movement, shutter opens, snail goes across the leaf, shutter closes. What's our snail look like? Well, one thing, it looks like the fastest snail in the world. It's going to be just one blur of a snail. We don't want that. We want as sharp a snail picture as we can get. What can I do? I can't change the light. We're using sunlight. I can't change the time. I want to change the time, but if I change the time, we're not going to fill up the sensor. I'm going to put the light back in the sky here, unless I do something else too. Lens cap goes on. Kidding about the lens cap. I need a bigger aperture to increase the rate of flow of the light going through the aperture and into the sensor, onto the sensor. Let's fix that. Thank you, Swiss Army. All right. And timer back to 0. Shutter closed. Ready, set, shutter open. Woohoo, faster flow. Bigger aperture lets light come through the hole more quickly, more readily, requiring less, it looks like less time to fill up our sensor. And well, that's about 34 seconds or so. Okay, not bad. Now let's review. We got the filter with the, okay. So I have changed my aperture to a bigger hole. Bigger hole, let's call that F11. ISO stayed the same, and we went to 32 seconds. Sunlight stayed the same too. If I change one thing, bigger hole, I must change another, shorter time. None of these things exists as an independent control. One always relates to the other. One always requires you to change something else. If one of them changes, you need to change another. Let's try this again. Only we've still got a kind of a blurry snail. What can we do? Aha! Let's go with a sensor rating, an ISO that doesn't require as much light. There we go. Same aperture. Let's see if we can freeze that snail in its tracks. Ready, set, go. Woo-hoo. Zip. Oh, that looks like about 7 seconds. 7 seconds. And we filled our sensor with light, because we made the sensor not require as much light. In the old days, you had to change your film or change the way you developed it, perhaps. But nowadays, you can select on your camera, or sometimes your camera does it for you, a sensor that does not require as much light. Let's chart our behavior. We're running out of room. The light stayed the same. Our aperture stayed the same. But we moved our sensor to 200 ISO, and we got our time down to, what was that? About 8 seconds? Not bad. Ooh, dare we? Your sensor can be set to a very, very sensitive setting. Not just for fun. Let's call this ISO 800. Well, maybe even 1600. Let's see what we can get. Ready, set. Boom. I think that was about 1 second. Are we full? Did we make a good exposure? You betcha. Why not use the 800 or 1600 or whatever that was all the time? Well, there are drawbacks. The sensor must make some compromises in quality in order to use that short of in order to increase its sensitivity that much, it must make compromises in the way it captures the image, and that usually compromises the quality. It used to be called grain with film, but now it's kind of pixely. The image is not usually as sharp. It's not as graduated in its color, in its tonality, And there's some drawbacks. There's always a compromise. That's the no free lunch theory. So anyway, that's pretty much it. When one thing changes, the other thing changes. Bear in mind, I'm not going to do that because there's so little time on this. If the sun goes down or comes behind the fog, the high upper marine layer, you need to... No. All right. Well, that was interesting. If the sun goes behind the clouds, then you need to adjust some part of your other exposure controls. You need to make a bigger aperture, perhaps, perhaps dial in a higher sensitivity on your sensor, or possibly a longer shutter speed. If you go more than 125th of a second, and I'll talk about this in another time, if your shutter speed goes longer in time than 1/125th of a second, that's a fraction. So 125 is the denominator. If your shutter speed needs to be at 1/60th of a second or 1/30th of a second, these are getting longer and longer, then you will need to somehow stabilize your camera because you really can't hold still that long. I've known a few people who can. They're amazing. You will want a tripod, perhaps. Or remember those, oh God, the little... the little the little toys that everyone thought was going to make them rich because you saved up your Beanie Babies and you kept a little tag on the ear. Well, now they're worth less than they were when you paid for them or your mom paid for them or something. So take a Beanie Baby, take a couple of them, smoosh the camera down in it, and it'll actually hold your camera fairly still. There's a lot of workarounds if you don't have a tripod, but if you do have a tripod, you'll be better off. So thank you so much. We'll pick this up again and we'll talk about how these relate to the numbers, perhaps on your camera if you have a DSLR. And even if you don't, if you're using a point and shoot, we'll talk about how the internal mechanism of the point and shoot relates to this set of conditions. Thank you so much. Adios.